Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into an absolutely jarring paradox. When we think of California, right, we usually picture sunshine, glamour, maybe a booming tech economy. But literally right in the heart of downtown Los Angeles, there's a reality that feels completely disconnected from the American dream. We're going to unpack Skid Row. We'll look past those flashy headlines and dive directly into the ground-level evidence to figure out how such a massive humanitarian crisis can exist in literally one of the richest places on the planet.
Just look at the massive scale of this paradox. On one hand, California's GDP actually just surpassed the entire nation of Japan in 2024. That makes it the fourth largest economy globally. We're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar economic powerhouse, home to a Hollywood sign and just staggering wealth. But then, separated by what feels like an invisible line, you have Skid Row. Just a short walk from all that extreme wealth is a 50-block radius, roughly 1 square mile, where over 6,000 unhoused individuals are living in tents and on the pavement in absolute extreme poverty. It's wild. It's almost as if the second you cross a specific street, the entire world just changes.
Section 1. Faces of Skid Row. Who exactly is living on these 50 blocks?
You know, it's really easy to look at a sprawling encampment and just make broad generalizations. But to actually understand this crisis, we've got to look at the individuals who make up this community. There isn't just one type of person on Skid Row. It's a huge, complex spectrum. Now sure, drug addiction is highly visible. It does impact the majority of folks down there, but it is definitely not the whole story. We're talking about military veterans who came home from war and never got the support they needed. We've got former convicts who served their time but walked out of prison with absolutely nowhere to go. There are people who are totally bankrupted by just one job loss or mounting medical debt. There are mental health patients essentially abandoned by the medical system. Every single person out there represents a completely different systemic failure.
Let's put a face to that data. Take Catherine, for example. She's been living on the streets of Skid Row for 15 months now. And here's the thing, she isn't refusing help. Actually, she's actively filed paperwork for housing. But because of incredibly rigid bureaucratic red tape, she keeps being told she just doesn't qualify. This is a massive takeaway for us, right? The assumption that people are only on the streets because they refuse to leave, it's just factually incorrect. So many people are desperately trying to navigate this labyrinth of paperwork only to get rejected and left stuck on the pavement.
We also see some incredibly unique and heartbreaking plights. Take this Venezuelan family. Think about the sheer gravity of this for a second. This family traveled through dangerous jungles, actually survived being kidnapped in Mexico, and finally made it to the United States. But instead of finding the American dream, they're living in a tent on these streets, terrified of the daily news and the constant threat of deportation. I mean, they have work permits. They literally just want to build a future for their kids. Yet they're paralyzed by fear and circumstance, relying on the street's resources to survive while waiting for an opportunity that probably feels completely out of reach.
Section 2. The billion-dollar debate. Where exactly is all the money going?
So California has spent billions of dollars since 2021 trying to fix this problem, which brings us to a massive systemic debate. If the state is wealthier than most nations on Earth and they are actively throwing literal billions of taxpayer dollars at this issue, why is the population of Skid Row only getting bigger? Well, on one side, you have local business owners and taxpayers who argue that providing unconditional free food, money, and honestly beautiful California weather actually incentivizes people to stay homeless. They argue some nonprofits might even have a financial interest in the crisis continuing just to guarantee their funding. There's even a serious allegation that other counties use Skid Row as a dumping ground to offload their own unhoused populations. But flip the coin, and organizations operating on the ground see it entirely differently. They argue that homelessness is simply outpacing the creation of new housing. Basically, every day more people fall into homelessness than get housed. They point to totally broken affordable housing models and a mental health system that's just in absolute ruins. It is a fiercely debated issue of personal accountability versus systemic collapse, and it's clear both sides feel like they are fighting a losing battle.
And you know, this whole debate over funding trickles all the way down to the pavement, where individuals feel totally abandoned by the state. Take this one resident who's been living on Skid Row for 13 years. They actually painted a sign and ironically named their tent the White House. Why? Well, in their eyes, the actual government isn't doing its job properly, so they've had to create their own twisted version of authority and stability right there on the sidewalk. It's a really dark, incredibly real illustration of how disconnected those billions of dollars in state budgets feel from the actual lived reality on these 50 blocks.
Section 3. Finding hope at midnight. Let's look inside the intervention.
When the macro systems fail, micro-interventions step in. There's one specific organization operating within the square-mile radius trying to stem the bleeding, and that's the Midnight Mission. Over 1 million meals, every single year, completely free of charge. Think about that number. It highlights the staggering sheer volume of need down there. Sometimes it's basically animalistic survival out there, with people fiercely competing for basic sustenance. Organizations like the Midnight Mission are stepping in as the absolute last safety net, literally preventing mass starvation in the middle of a major American city.
And the amazing thing is, they aren't just providing beds, they are actively trying to remove obstacles to self-sufficiency through education, recovery, and dignity. They house about 300 people at any given time in crisis and bridge housing, but they also run a super strict year-long drug and alcohol recovery program. They have specific apartments set aside just for families, so kids aren't sleeping on the pavement. And moving way beyond basic shelter, they run an education center teaching Microsoft Office so people can actually build resumes. They've even got a volunteer-run barbershop to help restore human dignity. But perhaps most importantly, their doors are open to the near-homeless. These are community members who have jobs, who pay rent, but simply can't afford groceries because inflation and the cost of living are just so high right now. They're fighting the crisis not just by treating those already on the streets, but by catching folks on the edge before they fall in.
Section 4. The root of homelessness. Looking beyond the symptoms.
Treating the physical symptoms of poverty is one thing, but we really have to ask, what is fundamentally driving this tragedy? I mean, food, shelter, clothing, those are immediate needs for sure. But if you talk to the experts who have dedicated their entire lives to walking these 50 blocks, they'll tell you something surprising. Poverty and addiction, those are often just symptoms of a much deeper, much more invisible disease. According to the people on the front lines, the absolute core of this crisis is a profound, heartbreaking disconnection from society. It's not just a lack of money, it's a total lack of a social safety net. It is loneliness. Look, when you or I face a crisis, a job loss, a medical emergency, a mental health breakdown, we usually have family, friends, or a community to fall back on, right? The people who end up on Skid Row have experienced a total severing of those ties. They are completely and utterly alone in the world. And when you are entirely disconnected from any community, slipping into the abyss of the streets becomes dangerously, dangerously easy.
This crushing isolation brings us to an incredibly somber testimony from a resident who feels entirely alienated from the world around him. When this person was asked if they wanted to leave Skid Row, their response wasn't about finding a nice apartment in a different city. They literally said, "I want to move to another planet." Wow. That is the voice of someone whose spirit has been fundamentally broken by a society they feel entirely detached from. It's a level of despair that goes way beyond economics. It's a crisis of the human soul, happening right under the shadows of trillion-dollar skyscrapers.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. If throwing billions of dollars at the problem hasn't worked, how do we even begin the hard work of truly reconnecting our fractured communities? If the data and the ground-level truth show us that homelessness is ultimately a symptom of profound social isolation, then just building more apartments is really only half the battle. This explainer shows us that fixing this paradox requires a lot more than just capital. It requires a fundamental shift in how we view and support the most vulnerable, disconnected members of our society. It challenges every single one of us to look at the invisible lines drawn in our own cities and ask ourselves what it really takes to bring someone back from the edge.